Hey everyone. So this is kind of a deeper dive for those of you who wanted to know more about mechanism of action, particularly of psilocybin. We were able to talk a little bit about MDMA yesterday in the context of PTSD. So I just want to take a little deeper dive into psilocybin. So as I mentioned yesterday, this is essentially sort of a serotonin-like molecule. Once the phosphorus group on the left side here is cleaved off, it becomes psilocin. So psilocybin is a prodrug for psilocin. Psilocin then is an agonist at multiple serotonin receptors, which makes sense because it has similar shape as serotonin, but particularly the serotonin 2A receptor is key for activating psychedelic types of effects. And so here's the overview of different kind of hypotheses as to how this works. And I'll dig into a deeper dive on each of these. So these include changing the way the brain talks to itself or changing functional connectivity. This is where like the default mode network gets into play, neuroplasticity, reopening of critical learning windows. This is only shown in mice models for right now. Being able to tolerate emotions, which we talked a little bit about in one of the questions yesterday about sort of experiential avoidance. And then finally, changing the story one has about themselves and maybe their depression or their trauma. And so probably some combination of all these effects is what accounts for this sort of rapid change that we see when psychedelic therapies are effective. And so the first one is really thinking about functional connectivity. And in order to understand this, we have to think about the brain as a prediction machine. So, in our evolution, it was advantageous for us to be able to take a small amount of information and then act on it. So if you and I, 10,000 years ago, were walking through the forest and a tiger jumped on you and ate you, and I managed to get away, it would be very wise of me to be careful, especially in that section of the forest, again in the future. And I might not wait until I saw the stripes of a tiger to get out of there. If I was walking through that same stretch of forest and I heard any kind of rumbling in the grass or anything like that, I would certainly not wait until this guy shows up because by then it might be too late. So what does this have to do with depression? Well, if we think about, adaptive learning. So adaptive learning in the 10,000 year ago scenario is that I better be careful in that area of the forest. But if I overlearn that idea, then I might not ever leave my cave, and that would be maladaptive because I'd starve to death. Now, we don't get chased by tigers too often anymore, but many of our patients have had adverse childhood experiences, adverse life experiences, and adaptive learning in there is that you have to be careful with some people. There's potential danger in life. But if we overlearn that, we might take a piece of information like somebody having a negative or a neutral face and make an erroneous prediction that that person is going to harm us or that they're upset with us, or we would think that we've done something wrong. So these are kind of common cognitive distortions in say depression. Um, so that looks like, depression or PTSD. Now, what psilocybin does is a little complicated, but let's walk through it. So there are a lot of serotonin 2A receptors on layer 5 of the cortex. So the cortex is actually organized into these different layers. And on the fifth layer, there's a lot of serotonin 2A receptors. And as you recall, that is the primary target for psilocybin. So these serotonin receptors are on these pyramidal neurons, and they project to GABA interneurons. So you're like, wait a second, okay. So you're basically turning on the inhibition. So what you get is a net inhibitory effect by activating these serotonin 2A receptors with the introduction of psilocybin. And because these things are so inhibitory, you're going to slow activity in certain areas of the brain, particularly in areas that are involved with routing information. So these, what are sometimes called connectivity hubs. Talk more about that in a second. And so the ability of the brain to kind of route information in a fairly predictable way becomes altered for the duration of time of the drug effects. Now, one area where this is valuable is something known as the default mode network. So let's talk about two different networks that work in conjunction with each other, but not at the same time. So I think I've mentioned this before. The default mode network is on when we're focused inward, when we're maybe meditating, and also when we have depression that involves a lot of rumination. On the other side, we've got the task positive network. The task positive network is what turns on when we are focusing outside of our own heads. So when we're focusing on sorting our email in the morning, that's using the two parts of the task positive network. One called the salience network, which is the part that goes on when we try and figure out what is important. And the other is the executive network, which is like, what do we do with that information? So normally, in a normal brain, when we are a normal non-depressed brain, I should say, when we are inwardly focused, we're not focusing on stuff outside of us. And the corollary is true. So when we're focusing on outside tasks, we're not really spending a lot of time going inward. When people have depression, this default mode network becomes what they call overstable. So the reason why I've got Andre the Giant sitting on the seesaw here is it's like when you have depression, this it's like the big kid comes and sits on the end of the seesaw, because normally these things should go back and forth. When you're focusing on something outside, task positive is active. When you are going inward, when you're going inward, default mode network is active. But when you have depression, you can't activate that task positive network because the default mode network becomes what they call overstable. So what psilocybin does is through that activating serotonin 2A, which activates GABA interneurons, decreases activity in these things called connectivity hubs. You can think of connectivity hubs as sort of like on a big airline network, you've got a connection. If I want to go to Des Moines, I'm going to have to probably go through Denver if I'm going on United from San Francisco, because Denver is the middle of the country's connection hub. So you have similar structures in your brain where information routes through. So these are things like the thalamus and the anterior cingulate, posterior cingulate. And what we've seen in fMRI studies is that the higher the dose of psilocybin, the more those areas of the brain go down in activity. So now information is being routed in really weird and unpredictable ways. So that's what this diagram, which you've probably seen 100 times, is trying to illustrate. So without drug, the brain kind of routes just like United in a very predictable way. On psilocybin, information is being shared within the brain in ways that are somewhat unpredictable and unusual. Maybe this accounts for synesthesia, where the auditory processing areas of the brain are talking to the visual processing. So you start sort of seeing sounds or hearing colors or what have you. But nevertheless, that's probably what is happening in the brain. And where this is relevant to depression would be this idea of pre-existing beliefs, or what Robin Carhart Harris calls overweighted priors or prior experiences. So these are kind of housed in the cortex. So that wrinkly part of the brain is where sort of has dominance over new information coming up through the brainstem through new experiences, right? And so we might think of these as automatic thoughts or negative schemas, depending on what psychotherapy school you want to use. But the idea is that in this state of sort of transient increased connectivity in the brain, this ability of the cortex to overdominate in this new information becomes destabilized. And that Robin's lab has pointed out this idea that there's this sort of flattening of the brain activity. And so in contrast, when the brain has gotten really good at doing something like having depressed thoughts and feelings, that's sometimes referred to as canalization. So this idea that you have this like canal, right, where it's very difficult to get out of that. So like if there's a ball rolling down a groove, it's most likely that the ball is going to stay in the groove. And the deeper that groove is, the more likely the ball is going to stay in there. Another metaphor that's sometimes used is like a ski slope at the end of the day, where the paths are pretty well carved. But under psilocybin, this sort of brain activity sort of flattens out, So now now the ball can kind of roll anywhere. Or to extend the ski metaphor, overnight there was a fresh dusting of snow. So now those previous tracks are kind of erased and you can go wherever you want. Okay, so the idea being that in the 4 or 5 hours of the psilocybin effects, this is happening. And then at some point after the drug wears off, that there's this kind of resetting that occurs. And this is, I think, stuff we're still trying to understand. But this idea that, in depression, this new information is coming in, this young woman who has depression goes out and has a good experience with her friends. But her cortex is sort of saying, it's making an erroneous prediction. It's saying if they really knew about you, they would not be your friend, right? But under psilocybin, perhaps she has a similar experience, but this time without that overdominance of the cortex, without that canalization of previous experiences, we're now more sensitive to that information. And subjectively, we have this feeling of maybe like, yeah, maybe I am worthy of love. Maybe I am worthy of friendship. Okay, so that's the network activity, canalization, entropic brain theory idea. Switching gears to the idea of rapidly acting neuroplastic processes. So there are, as we've talked about, obviously these synaptic receptors for serotonin, but there are also serotonin receptors inside the cell, we call intracellular receptors. Just like you thought it couldn't get more complicated, right? But we have these receptors, and it seems that psilocybin may be activating, or DMT in this case, dimethyltryptamine, a very similar compound to to psilocin, may be activating these serotonin 2A receptors inside the cell, these intracellular receptors. And then that causes a similar kind of final common pathway that we see with other rapidly acting antidepressants or even slow acting antidepressants. So things that we've already talked about, like TrkB and BDNF, and something we're going to talk about next week when we get to glutamate, mTOR. So triggering these neuroplasticity cascades. And as we've talked about before, neuroplasticity is associated with antidepressant response. Okay, so that's neuroplasticity. Let's switch to idea number 3. This has only been shown in animals, so don't overextend this idea here, but it's a compelling, interesting thought. It came from Gul Dolan's lab. Gul used to be at Hopkins and she's now at Berkeley. But this idea that in mice have this window of time when they're young, when they really learn social behavior from play. And there's a certain point in a mouse's life, don't remember how many days it is, and where that window basically closes. And the genes that are responsible for that pathway also start to deactivate. They turn off. Okay. So you take a mouse who's beyond that cutoff period and you give it a psychedelic. God knows how you do this, but you give it a psychedelic. And what they found was that those genes that are responsible for that kind of social learning turn back on. And they seem to turn back on for a duration of time, which is somewhat proportionate to the duration of the drug. So for example, ketamine, a fairly short acting drug, turn those genes on for 24 to 48 hours. A longer acting drug like LSD turned on for, I think, 5 to 7 days, something like that. And so this is a really compelling finding if this turns out to be true in humans, because there are a lot of kind of conditions that might benefit from that reopening of that window. Not to stretch this too far, but I wonder if this sort of afterglow integration period is maybe what is showing up here, that there's this period of time where people can really learn and try out new experiences, maybe tolerate new emotions that they couldn't before, that we really should be thinking about how to take advantage of that in an integration period. Yeah, so here's that heat map of these genes. These are all the different genes that are being turned on at various time points, depending on the drug. And interestingly, they compared this to a saline and cocaine comparator and found that all these different psychedelics, LSD, ketamine, ibogaine, and psilocybin, all reopen these windows, but saline and cocaine did not, which is an interesting finding. And there's that correlation between the duration of time that the window is reopened, how that sort of is proportionate to the duration of effect of the drugs. All right, idea number 4. So the idea of that I talked about briefly yesterday, the idea that a lot of conventional antidepressants kind of numb emotional experiences, so they actually maybe make anhedonia worse. And psychedelics do kind of the opposite. So they kind of push people towards emotional experiences. So, there's a kind of, of course, all of our patients want to feel better, but a lot of times they don't want to go into the difficult stuff in order to get there. And so there's this sort of aversion that occurs to feeling those feelings. And so the hypothesis here is, could a psychedelic therapy experience make that experience of feeling your emotions more tolerable? Because we know that when people have these sort of big psychological experiences, these what we might call kind of breakthrough experiences or ego dissolution or insight in a psychedelic experience, that tends to decrease this experience of experiential avoidance in the same way that like the MDMA study that I showed you yesterday allowed people maybe to feel their feelings a little more. So this is an interesting finding, right? Complicated mathematical model here to prove that, which I won't belabor. But this concept is more like, could that difficult psychological experience under a psychedelic be kind of like the challenge that we submit our bodies to when we get a vaccine? You got your COVID shot, you felt kind of lousy for a couple of days because your body was ramping up an immune response to that virus protein, and afterwards you were stronger for it. So maybe coming out of this, people have this saying, I went through this really hard time under the psychedelic, but I'm better for it on the other side. So maybe that's part of it. Okay. And then finally, number 5, which probably gets most of the press because this is kind of the sexier part, but this idea in Jungian psychology and archetypal psychology of a hero's journey. You're like, what am I talking about? If you've seen a movie, you've seen a hero's journey, because many stories in the human sort of pantheon are hero's journey. So hero's journey, classic example of this that probably you've seen would be Star Wars. So in a hero's journey, the hero is called to adventure. He's kind of in his everyday life. So Luke is this kind of whiny little brat, growing tomatoes on some desert somewhere, and then things happen, right? There's a turn of events. His uncle buys some droids. The droids have a message hidden inside. He meets this old guy, Obi-Wan Kenobi, who turns out to be who invites him to come over the threshold. So when they're called to adventure, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. And Obi-Wan looks at Luke and says, we have to go help them. He's called across the threshold. He's sort of taken the psychedelic, if you will. He's going into another world. And he has helpers. He has people who help him along the way. He has a mentor in Obi-Wan Kenobi and later in Yoda, right? He goes through this very difficult experience. He's kind of reborn as a different person. He has to go through these big challenges. He has to fight his dad. He has to blow up his dad's house, right? And he comes back to his everyday life, still the same person, but changed inside. So is a psychedelic experience, a big psychedelic experience, kind of like this hero's journey? You are going through your normal life, you go across the threshold, you go through some very difficult things, maybe you revisit some painful times in your life, you have a different experience of them, and the drug wears off and you come back to your regular life. And, we see this in qualitative reports from people having gone through psychedelic experiences, this feeling of being able to free themselves from their own kind of binds, to really start to kind of put the big picture together, and to feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves, and maybe they are open to that experience. One of the early findings of psychedelic studies was that for the most part, personality characteristics don't really change in adulthood. They're fairly stable. But one thing that seemed to change after the psilocybin experience was that people felt more open. So there was this increase in openness on a personality scale. And, perhaps there's something about that that allows people to shift the way they experience their depression or PTSD or whatever it is they're being treated. And a lot of times people have these big experiences that could be called awe. And awe is an interesting phenomenon because when we experience awe, think about the first time you saw the Grand Canyon, or, you saw your child being born, or whatever it was that induced awe in you. There is this feeling of like the world is so much bigger than us, and that we have to shift in order to accommodate that. The world is not we are just one small part of the world. And in a way, there's a big sense of relief with that. And we know from psychological studies of awe that if you have an awe experience, you don't need to have all the answers. Like you don't need to have this sort of cognitive closure. And it also tends to encourage people to do things positive for other people. So it's a sort of pro-social thing. So, maybe this is what is happening when people have a big experience under a psychedelic. And so finally, I just want to leave you with this idea here from James Hillman, the Jungian psychologist, who's talked about, that people, I love this quote. He said, people come to therapy really for a blessing, not so much to fix what's broken, but to get what's broken blessed. And I just really appreciate that because, one of the things that sometimes people come out of these psychedelic therapy experiences is that I'm okay. I don't have to know the answers. I don't have to fix everything, but I'm fundamentally okay as I am. And so that's what I see sort of reflected here. So I hope this helps a little bit. Thanks for the extra time, and hope this is useful. We can talk about it next week in class. Bye.